We've now reached Chapter 6. Chapter 6, we're going to go more into exploring concepts of self, how society shapes our identity. Additionally, we're really going to dive into gender, because nothing has been more dynamic over the last 20 years than our understanding and our expression of gender within society. Just to give you an idea, the last edition of this very book only gave gender about a paragraph, 3 sentences, that was it. But between that publication and this publication, we are now exploring an entire chapter, which I think is an important step because gender truly does help us shape our face, our authentic self, and how we represent ourselves to the world. We want to talk about the differences between sex and gender. We want to talk about gender fluidity. We're going to talk about traits of gender, as well as go into gender and relationships. Understanding gender. Shift within society of how gender is perceived. Gender polarizes virtually every aspect of who we are. We often got caught into the binary in the past, male, female, and that is how we looked at everything. However, that took voice away from a lot of people, changed our relationships with others, and modified how we communicate with each other. The considering of binary poles of femininity and masculinity creates a very black and white world, one where we don't truly exist. As we go through gender, we'll find out that it is more of a fluid thing, more of an expression of self. And we used to categorize it as high or low. Now, what we want to do with interpersonal communication is connect with people and not put them on a scale. And we'll talk about a scale coming up here in a minute, but that's an idea that we can now explore and see where we've gone from there. Gender fluid, discarding the old binary concepts. You know, now we are looking at gender in a much more diverse way and much more encompassing, where we're no longer just looking at gender as being masculine or feminine. Now, instead, we have traits of both. We are complex people, and for that reason, our gender identity is likewise complex. Consider the symbolic importance now of Mr., Mrs., they, Ms., he, she, they, them. You know, we are now beginning to find that people are expressing that even on their signature blocks. So that way we have a way to communicate that is non-threatening and connects with the people we're reaching out to. Now, sex or gender. This is oftentimes really blurred. People think that sex is gender and gender is sex. However, let's think about this for a moment. Let's explore a little bit. Sex is talking about anatomy, the biology, the genitalia, the internal reproductive organs, hormones, and sex chromosomes. It is very much a biological thing. Do we always think of ourselves in a biological format? Or do we think of ourselves beyond our biology or that format? Do we think of ourselves more in depth, as of having more layers? Absolutely. I don't just think of myself as a carnivore vegetarian mammal. No, we think of ourselves in a much more diverse fashion, whether it be a professor, whether it be a student, perhaps a judge, a police officer, you know, all these things are social identity. And the same way we don't think of, oh, hey, that police officer over there is a mammal. No, we think of them as a police officer. And the reason why is because that's more of a social construct. It is telling you what they do and how they function within our society. So gender is a broader term encompassing the social, psychological, behavioral attributes that particular cultures associate with an individual's biological sex. That does tie us more back into the binary. But I think we need to break from that binary, especially when we're looking at our society, because our society is no longer just looking at it as masculine, feminine, male, female. We're no longer just looking at people as their sex, we're looking at them as individuals. Now, going back to putting people into categories, science loves to do that, including the social sciences. We like to be able to categorize things so we can understand them. Kinsey was a psychologist back in the late 40s, early 50s that was trying to differentiate sexual orientation as well as gender identity. And for that reason, he came up with this scale to try to categorize people into what they are, to a degree, to a fashion. A very scientific move for that period of time when everything had to be quantitative. And now we're looking at more qualitative aspect of it, where instead we're allowing people to express themselves. But let's dive into Kinsey for a second here. As you can see, he gave a scale from 1 to 6 of sexual attraction. And this 1 to 6 broke it down into extensively, exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual. However, this isn't the world that we live in. So if you look at this category, it was an early attempt to broaden the perspective about gender identity and sexual attraction. However, I think we've come farther than that. Because if we were to stop for a moment and put the pros and cons here, here's a few I came up with. Absolutely feel free to add in the discussion pros and cons you see with the category approach. One of the pros was he actually took it from either you were heterosexual or you were homosexual and instead created variations. In other words, he expanded the view, the social view of it, to understand that there was bisexual individuals, there are people that are asexual, there are multiple of attractions out there. And so this was at least the first attempt to expand our view. On the con side, it was still a necessity to apply a number and to plug people into categories. And by plugging people into categories, you take away the fluidity, the changes, that people grow, they find out different things about themselves as they're exploring their authentic self. So it was a limitation still placed on it. So it expanded, but it still provided limits. And those things can absolutely collide and cause trouble for people. Gender is learned. And if you really think about it, we start celebrating gender, especially sexual aspect of it, of being male or female, before our children are even born. We have these gender reveal parties. We paint the nursery in according colors. We buy toys based on it. So when this child comes out, it is already being taught how to act and how it should act. And this has caused trouble for people, as well as it has made it seem like a rebellious thing for a person to disclose who they are or to reveal their gender to others or their orientation. Really, it wasn't a case of rebellion. It's just that that never fit from the very beginning. So gender reveal parties, naming the child, dressing the child, and early education, you put the basketball in the boys and you put the teddy bear in the girls. These type of things definitely is the beginning of teaching. Gender is a social construct. We don't have the image of male or female until we actually start drawing in from society expectations. Oh, the man isn't supposed to cry, he's supposed to be tough and sturdy, the woman's supposed to be emotional. And when we start applying these, we actually limit who a person can be. So society assigns norms. And as we've seen within our society over the past decade to 20 years, those norms have started coming down. Those norms are no longer as prevalent. Instead, we're starting to let people express themselves and be who they are. Enforced through social constructs such as bathrooms, medical care, career opportunities. And this is still a case of where you're seeing this with women still struggling to get ahead in the corporate world because that's not the image that they have for them. That's not what their gender is supposed to do. Or if a man takes a job as a secretary or a nurse perhaps, they're considered odd in their profession. However, that's not true. There are many good CEOs that are women, and there are many good nurses that are male. The main thing is that we start looking at what people are contributing rather than how society defines them. When we think about bathrooms, if you've been to a campus lately, that's something that's changed within the last 3 years. We now have gender-neutral bathrooms, something we never had before. So society changes, and as society changes, so does how we perceive gender. Now, when we start looking at stereotypes, and we talked about stereotypes and prejudice, too often we do this quickly just by viewing a person, and nothing is as obvious to people as gender or male, female, and so we automatically throw expectations at a person, a stereotype, and then we no longer listen to comprehend. Instead, we are listening to confirm our own biases. So if we're listening to a man talk, we're waiting for aggression to prove that men are aggressive, or we're waiting for him to drop a curse word, or we're looking for him to be intimidating. Meanwhile, we're looking for women to use lots of words and less aggressive, both verbally and non-verbally. And when they challenge that, we have a tendency to be off-put by that. But in all honesty, it's our problem, not theirs. It's a case of where we need to, and the same as when we saw cultural stereotypes and we saw racial stereotypes, and we've talked about these other ones, we have to realize that is in our head. The person is who they are. And so we need to learn to overcome that. When we start to look at why we feel certain ways about male or female, or perhaps bisexual individuals, we also, or LGBTQ community, it's because of media. It truly is. Pop culture reflects our society. It's that mirror that when we look in it, we say, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what I'm supposed to expect. And we still have a lack of diversity within our media. About 64% of our media comes from males. Only 36 and less than 1% is unidentified. So automatically we're filtering it through a perspective that's somewhat biased based on who they are. And if we could get those numbers more equal, we would have a less filtered, less biased approach to how we view the world. I mean, that's the reason why we see the same movies being remade and remade. It's because it appealed to them when they were young, it appeals to them and they're in power now. So you'll see that go through. So are these true or false? Or are they a self-fulfilling prophecy? Now, self-fulfilling prophecy is a case of where you expect something of someone, and so therefore you help that to become true. If you expect someone to fail and they succeed, you just say, just wait, they'll fail eventually. And then when they fail, see, I was right. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-efficies are when we view it for ourselves. If we say, I'm going to fail, and then you do fail. So if you expect something based on gender, you're already creating self-fulfilling prophecies that change how you interact with people. If you look at these, males are considered assertive, but if the woman does the same thing, they're considered moody. Males are authoritative, women are considered argumentative when they're displaying the same trait. So instead, we need to get beyond looking at those portrayals and start looking at the individual themselves. Gender and relationships. Gender and relationships, friendship, tokenism, and a shift in social views. Now, it used to be that we always tend to group based on gender because gender had been such a large part of our society. Now, people's orientation, their gender identity is no longer as important. We found in the past that tokenism is when you have a minority group represented in your group just for the basis of it demonstrates you don't have a prejudice or you don't have any type of bias. And you'll hear this often with, oh no, I have this person that works with me, so I can't have that issue. No, it's untrue. That's tokenism. Now, when we become less focused on identity and more focused on the individual, we'll find it's easier to talk to them. We let our barriers down because interpersonal communication is about vulnerability. If you can be vulnerable with a person, you can hear them and they can hear you. Romantic relationships, now we're seeing that people of the LGBTQ plus community are now able to express who they love. Because in the end, love is love. And so they're now able to express who they are and able to get married, able to have long-term relationships. I want you to think about this for a minute. As I'm sitting here, I'm about ready to turn 53 years old. This might be shocking to some people that actually I'm older than the right to marry outside of your own race. That's right, because the loving ruling came down in the late 60s, early 70s, where interracial marriages became allowable in many states. Before then, it was illegal. Isn't that weird? And think about this. Many of you sitting there that are young, you're going to be older than the right for people to enter into relationships that have the same sex. So things are changing, and it really is hard to imagine how fast they are changing society, but they are changing. So what we really want to talk about today and through this chapter is sex and gender. Gender fluidity, traits of gender, and gender in relationships. This is a tough one to talk about because it is so easy to be afraid of offending people. And we don't want to do that, and especially when we're talking about interpersonal communication and relationships. We don't want to offend. Just like culture, one of the best ways to not be offensive is to practice listening. To listen to people, to let them express who they are, and take them for who they are, not try to mold or change them.